right, thank you for joining us today. This is the second and last Dialogues of the semester. Today we'll be discussing the diagram, and so we extend a thank you to the faculty who are joining us today, and to all of you as well for coming on a Friday evening to be with us. So my name is Caleb Lightfoot, and tonight I'll be Googling, and so I'll be providing a stream of images to supplement the conversation. So if you have any references or anything like that that you think of, just motion to me, and I'll try to subtly slip it on there. So.
Hi, my name is Maribel Rangel. Is that you have. Oh. And I'll be moderating tonight, so I'll be sitting over there.
Okay, and I'm the person that shoots this at you when you have a question. So if you have a question, direct your view towards me, and I will try to get your question heard. Okay, do you want to get started?
Let's get started. So our panelists for tonight are Professor Gomez. Gomez received his Bachelor's of Architecture from the Universidad Anahuac, Mexico City. He completed his graduate studies at AA London. He also has a Master's in Architecture from UNAM University in Historic Preservation. Professor Gomez is an architect with expertise in theory, criticism, and design. Considered as one of the he has been teaching in 14 universities in the US, Mexico, Spain, and England, including SARC, AA, Art Center, Tulane, University of Colorado, Louisiana State, University of Kansas, Texas Tech University, University of Salamanca, Anahuac, UNAM, and Iberoamericana. His education background, which is focused in both extremes, historic preservation and architectural design, derives in a particular interest in analyzing historic scenarios in order to design contemporary architecture within that context. Our other panelist today is Dr. Buellings. Dr. Buellings received her PhD in architecture at the University of California in Los Angeles. She received her master's in civil engineering techniques from Free University of Brussels in Belgium. She also received a master's in architecture from the Higher Institute of Architects, St. Luke's, Brussels in Belgium. She is the co-founder of Education of Computer-Aided Architectural Design in Europe. And we also have Professor Rob. Professor Rob received his Bachelor's of Architecture from the University of Florida. He has a Master's in Architecture with a specialization in sustainable design from the University of Austin in Texas. Professor Rob has taught graduate and undergraduate studios at Texas Tech and at UT at Austin. His research and creative objectives focus in the integration of varied sustainable strategies, both passive and active, cultural and technological, materials assemblies, and fabrication techniques, increasingly essential in today's environmental sensitive climate. So today we're going to be talking about the diagram. We're going to start with a quote from Mark Garcia. He explains that the diagram is subjected to the diverse definitions and different conceptualizations of its use. These differences become apparent in the way diagrams are described and valued in relation to architecture, with respect to validity, true status, their ontological standing as both process and objects, and as a mental and material phenomena. From the 9-square grid to the bubble diagram to the partie to the superimposed diagrams of the city, the diagram is a significant instrument in our architecture career. So we will begin the discussion today by asking, is the diagram a starting point or a byproduct of the design process?
Okay. By the way, this is a good reference, guys. That's a very good book that you can start with. Diagram by Mark Garcia, AD editorial. So suggested to look for it, please. That's a very good one. Now that I'm telling you books, you'll have it. Of course, you gotta check out Stan Allen's books. One that is named Points and Lines, which is the first one, and the second one, Field Conditions as well. And the other one that I will suggest as well to look is Research Numemoto, the Atlas of Null Tectonics. There's many other ones. I mean, previews kind of like books as well, information that you may be looking for, including Manhattan Transcripts by Bernard Schumi, and many others kind of like they may come out when we're discussing on this. So that's just like a little brief kind of comment. Diagrams are as old as architecture itself. It's nothing really new. Okay. The only thing is that now we are appropriating kind of like the use of the diagram, not just as for creating architecture. They have many more kind of like possibilities. Diagrams have been used for many things, not just for architecture. And diagrams is not just about kind of talking about vocal diagrams, which I may make my comments about that as well in a few minutes, which is something that came up Bauhaus. And I think we're living in a moment in which kind of like the possibilities of the diagrams are going beyond architecture actually.
I mean, I think you could diagram anything, right? So you can diagram anything from an aircraft, like how to get off the aircraft, or how to put a piece of IKEA furniture together. You could diagram like a site or a city, like what this quote is talking about, or the quotes where you can actually begin to distill information. So you can take a diagram. A diagram for me is a way to kind of trim down or kind of distill an entire array of elements, whether it be cities and streets and or ways that people move. In addition to, it can actually begin to be a generative tool. But I think there's two different ways that you can begin to think about a diagram. One is as to generate architecture, so using a diagram to be as an integral portion of the design process, which is, I think, is probably what the focus of the education and the use of diagram in an educational model or in pedagogy, it should be, as diagram as a way to generate and a way to distill information, maybe clarify in the designer's mind what they're trying to get at, whether it be a sentence or a way of feeling or a spatial condition, and then to use different line weights or different types of tones or color or whatever to begin to distill and compact that idea into a singular drawing or a singular model. I don't think diagrams have to be drawing per se. And the other way I think the diagrams are used, like for example, big Bjarke Ingels, they use diagrams a lot, and it's more to sell an idea. Actually, to market something for their competition. So it's a way of taking maybe a complex project or a complex idea, or maybe 100,000 unit apartment complex with mixed use and towers and like their mountain, and it's a way of kind of saying this is actually what we're thinking. So we extrude and twist and slice and cut, and that's actually those are the kind of the four operations that we've taken on this building. So it's a way to I think a diagram is also a way to translate an idea or even kind of post-rationalize an idea of maybe a complex set of complex scenarios or a complex set of issues that an architect is dealing with, or even an urban planner. Like how do you actually take the design for a city and actually distill it down into a 3D drawing or a small model. So I think those are the two different ways I see diagrams. One is a generative tool, and the other is kind of post-rationalistic and kind of saying this is what I'm doing as a way to. But both are ways to distill a lot of information into a few lines or a few pieces of basswood or chipboard or something.
I'm going to try to start maybe talking about a diagram and its definition. You say diagram is not a drawing. Diagram, and that might be an interesting idea later on.
No, it's not always a drawing. It could be a drawing, it could be a model. Diagrammatic, something that describes something, not represents something.
It's certainly a way of visualizing an abstract idea. I think that's what a diagram is. I brought a book, and there was a lot of contention about the 100 diagrams that changed the world. And I don't know when it was published, very recently, and it indeed starts with, maybe we can look at were the drawings, the earliest drawings of the cave drawings of 30,000 BC. It runs all the way over the Vitruvian Man drawing as a diagram, two diagrams of the camera obscura, which is, from the Netherlands. So that's in what they call diagrams. There's also, it goes all the way up to diagrams that, are depicting how to put together an IKEA shelf, and that's from 1956. That's exactly 56 years old, that diagram in here. And the latest diagram is the iPod. Maybe you can all see the diagram of the iPod. I just found this, by the way, in Barnes & Noble. I ordered it right away for the library, and our dear Professor Pearl had the courtesy extended to me to borrow me his. This is the latest type of. So this is one way of using the word diagram as a noun. I think what Professor Rob was talking about is diagram as a process. Diagramming can be used in an analytic or in a generative, in the synthetic phase, the generation of design versus the analysis of design. But I think it has to have a component of visualization of ideas, and it's spatial in that sense, pictorial, or maybe in the, as a graph. It is something that allows us to communicate abstract conceptual ideas in terms, but it is a pictorial element to me. Pictorial meaning it's based out of point, lines, planes, volumes, in 1, 2, 3-dimensional space. But it is spatial or symbolic, but it is a pictorial element. I might be wrong, but to me that's the furthest I got with that type of what is diagramming. And it is related to mapping our ideas, but I think mapping can be symbolic, can be way broader than a diagram where we graphing, and that's my understanding at this point. Obviously, it's a word that covers a lot of definitions, and you can go to Wikipedia and look up all the diagramming, and you get a whole list of all the types of diagrams, bubble diagrams, free body diagrams. You all should know that from history, right? The free body diagram, right?
I forgot about that one.
Isn't that a good one? I love that free body diagram, right? In structures we use it, all the way to diagramming flow, charts, diagramming bubble diagrams. And now he's going to get on my nerves because he doesn't like those.
Yeah, I'm going to my comments on that. Well, first of all, continuing with this introduction, I think there's some diagrams that you guys got to see that are kind of seminal as well in this process. The first ones that I pull out, that definitely kind of the diagrams developed by Marcel Duchamp. And his big glass is one of examples of that. There's a beautiful book by Octavio Paz, which is about the bride stripped bare and her bachelors, even in Spanish, El Castillo, La Pureza, Castle Purity, and explains so beautifully kind of like all the diagrammatic process that Marcel Duchamp took in order to develop his masterpiece, which was later on destroyed after the exhibition, unfortunately, in minutes. And that's what he told, that was a perfect data example of it. This beautiful kind of like diagrammatic piece is a representation of many, many different kind of activities and events by utilizing kind of like objects in diagrams. I mean, you have the bride on the top that kind of like evolves and drops all that energy that goes into the bachelors, which are the 9 objects that we have down there, which are kind of the shape of these milk cans, and then that kind of like these guys get really excited, and then they produce chocolate that gets into the chocolate grinder, and then that kind of chocolate kind of like gets through these filters and then kind of like becomes a gas and gets through that right side, which we can see those filters, gets filtered, and the tamices are kind of like the cones, and then from there kind of like goes back up into the sky and creates the Milky Way, which again kind of is what gives energy to the bride. It's a beautiful process of diagramming love. That's all what it means. How is kind of that interaction between kind of like two human beings when they get in love. And this exchange of pheromones kind of happened over there, no? It took him 9 years to develop this. 9 years just diagramming, and making a lot of kind of different formulas. So we gotta start reading it on that particular kind of way. There's very old diagrams. I mean, we can go all the way to, I don't know, to kind of like 1521, and we can find kind of diagrams by Cesare Cesariano in the 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius, in which kind of he's applying the golden section diagrams in order to kind of develop cathedrals and so on. So it comes so far away. And then,
How does that relate to architecture?
wait a minute, I'm going there.
But this is a different type of diagram, right? This is
Yes,
not,
indeed.
This is not generative. This is not about the 9 years of
It is
process.
generative. Yes, indeed. It was
This is an
absolutely-
instruction. This is like an IKEA piece of furniture.
No. Oh, that minute.
Go back to this one on the left. The drawing on the left. It's just a series of numbers and a list of things.
Exactly.
It's a
So
shopping-
each
it's a
one of
shopping
those
list.
each one of those ones is an object. No, it's not an IKEA object. Come
It's
on.
like a recipe.
You cannot desacralize the master of all the masters, which is Mr. Marcel Duchamp. It's almost God for me. There's a lot of diagrams. I don't know if they can pull it up on internet. Which
then
he
let's-
created
let's
in order to
focus-
create
let's
this
focus on this
piece.
then.
In order to create this piece, the big glass. This is just an introduction. That in order to explain everybody that diagrams are not just for architects, and also have been applied by many other fields. And one case scenario is Marcel Duchamp on his artwork.
But this isn't about process.
It is about process, and the whole thing is about process. It's 9 years of processing all this investigation in order to create a big glass that was destroyed just after it was shown. Yes?
It still exists.
Well, they assemble piece by piece, and it's
It's better.
they glued it. It's much better now, yes, absolutely. They glued it piece by piece. Yeah, but you can, No, I mean, can you find an image of the big glass, not of the diagram of the big
Same
glass?
numbering system?
Well, I mean, but
What's the difference?
No, what's
that's not my point. I think you're not understanding. You're not understanding my solution. So let's go. Move forward.
Explain. Please explain it to me.
Well,
Can you show one of the piece, not the diagram of the piece, explaining what is each one of the objects of that piece? Just type the big glass, Marcel Duchamp. Then we will see. This is an explanation of what is each one of the objects of it. But the big glass shall be there in a couple minutes, which is very different than what you're talking about the IKEA dishwasher. This is done by somebody to explain what is each one of the objects and drive us through the process of how he developed it. Here we go.
Dishwasher
Like
seems much
example,
more
the second one. Yeah, it could be that one. That one is the shattered piece of glass that was glued piece by piece today. That's beautiful. It's amazing.
Well,
Well, let's move forward because
Yeah.
it's just an introductory thing, and I want to kind of like open a discussion with refrigerators from IKEA or dishwashers from IKEA and Marcel Duchamp.
They make very nice stuff.
Let's move forward. Okay.
And the instructions.
Let's
the
talk
diagrams
about Le Corbusier and his bubble diagrams, and particularly one that he did for Le Marseille. And here we come. Now it's coming more interesting.
This is good.
Okay. Can you please show one?
so Peter,
Bubble diagram, Le Corbu, please.
For you, diagramming's only generative? We can go in that direction for the discussion.
Oh, no.
In my explanation about this one, coming back to this one, in here was generative and was a product of as well. The final product is a diagram itself, but it was generated by the process of a diagram as well.
Yes.
So that's what I mean. The definition of diagram is not just about generating something. It can go beyond the final product.
So yeah, Javier was talking about this long process,
Correct.
and that this was the result of that. And I don't see tying it back to the initial question about how can diagramming, be generative or like work with the design process, or is it just a kind of an end game, or like
Both things.
Yeah, right. It can be both things, but I don't see this diagram as a generative. I see this as a more of a kit of parts, like. Put number one into number two, slot A, slot B.
No, that's because you saw those images that got with the little numbers. But that's not the big glass. The big glass is far more than that. It's gotta be in its altar. And I think it is. It's beautiful. Okay, here we go. Bubble diagrams. Okay? I think some of you love bubble diagrams, guys. I just like bubbles in the bathtub. I just like bubbles in the bathtub, that's it. They were kind of like developed firstly kind of like in Bauhaus, so they're also very old. If there's some faculty here that push you to the bubble diagram, it's because they're as old as Bauhaus, I guess. But I don't trust on them anymore. I don't believe on them anymore. Why? Because they were in a moment in which kind of like architect was developing in 2 dimensions. And nowadays we have the possibility in designing, start designing in 3 dimensions, not just that. The big accident of the bubble diagrams is that somehow kind of like, yes, it's an organization chart. It kind of like organizes different spaces on architecture. It shows kind of like the relationship between those spaces. But then what happens? What about the space itself? We don't touch it on there. And the big problem that arose by creating this bubble mania was that a lot of kind of students and architects themselves kind of like just develop a floor plan straightforward from it, and then just extrude walls up and punch windows and doors on it, and that was it. Architecture is done. It's functional. It works. Give me a break. It doesn't work. Architecture is far more than just a 2D kind of diagram like this one.
Okay, I'm going to stop you.
You're from that generation? Oh. Sorry.
Thank you. Second time today. If you don't know, yes, I'm a dinosaur. Give me a hug when I leave. I'll be called old. So gracefully, I will appreciate it. I think the Bauhaus did way more than it. Bubble diagrams, and I think is some of the reasons we diagram in architecture is to explicit certain decisions, you know, that we made, and just merely talking about those decisions. In other words, a bubble diagram is an example of what is called by Venn, and this is, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go to some mathematics in Venn diagrams, and it is used in computability because it is what are the elements and what are relationships between the elements. And if you look at the history of mathematics, mathematicians use still what are called graphs. These are Venn diagrams, and Venn diagrams that are, now go to graphs and Google a little bit about graphs. And I agree with some of the mistakes that were made, but graphs are used, for example, to understand, to classify things. Now, graphs in mathematics are used to just merely, these are not graphs, these are charts. Graphs, explicit, and you will find some examples, graphs are elements and just purely relationships. So it is purely combinatorics. It's not spatial. Graphs are used then to select, for example, trees. And I hope we can see some graphs that are trees. Graphs, and Wikipedia has graphs on there, I'm sure. You have trees, you have circuits, you have different types of connections in an algorithm. And here we go. Okay, the one on the top is a tree. Me, mom, dad, and then, you know, that is called a tree. You have cluster diagrams. Now, for those who remember, now I'm going back, when Christopher Alexander tried to resolve, that's a circuit, you know, there are different types of solutions to a problem, and it doesn't deal with where they are located. It's not spatial, it's way more abstract. And that's what graphs are for and used in order to either say, in a tree diagram, the classification presumes a total ordering system. And it has been pointed out that design is not a total order. Look at the notes of synthesis of form, which should be called notes on the analysis of function, where, you know, when we analyze things, we can break it down into isolated parts. Mom's mom, mom's dad, and things like that. When we design in a synthetic phase, is we take two elements together and the part is more than the whole. So it's not a total order. So I agree and disagree totally disagree. It's still a useful tool. You just need to know when you use a diagram and for what purpose. And if it's only about what are the relationships that you want to emphasize, that is what mathematicians use. And I'm sorry, it's a useful tool. Nobody has ever said that a bubble diagram has to become a spatial element. There are different steps. We're talking about generation. That is what it entails. And I think we use diagrams to explicit our idea, represent our ideas, discuss these ideas, and not think about the shape of the room, about our spatial vocabulary, about our spatial relationship, proportion, symmetry, concept ideas, but merely to take a program and rather than a list of unclassified, unordered, bulleted requirements, we start ordering them. It's a system of ordering them, but on a combinatoric level.
But let me tell you something. I think you touched a point really interesting here, which is Christopher Alexander. Somehow he was one of the
He's
top.
also a dinosaur.
A dinosaur, exactly. That was what I was saying.
Like Deschamps, by the way.
Okay. And he's the one that kind of developed the idea of the operational truth. That somehow the diagram is merely kind of operational. After him, and it's also long time ago, 1980s, Colin Rowe and Coeter kind of developed also other kind of diagrams, which kind of like you may have been using them as well, the Nolly plan and all the figuregram kind of diagrams, developed through understanding the theories of Gestalt, which became the formal truth. So the first one, Christopher Alexander, is operational. It kind of drives you different operations, while Colin Rowe made something that is more like the formal understanding of whatever we have around us. Here we go, in order kind of to develop. Both are diagrams, but they're very different one to each other. Nowadays, I think the whole definition of diagram has been extending more and more and more, and we can diagram absolutely everything. One of the people as well, pretty old, and that also kind of like gave us that opportunity to expand or extend kind of these possibilities is Guy Debord. And Guy Debord, one of the principal member of the international situationism, he developed very beautiful diagrams, kind of like developed by the derive, like the drifting. So you can point it out over there, situationism. And there's particularly one that is very interesting. In his scenario, here you go, the first one. He's kind of like showing us the different kind of districts in Paris and telling us kind of like this social aspect between the districts. So Christopher Alexander, operational, Colin Rowe, formal, Guy Debord, social. He's kind of like trying to bring those kind of like those different relationships that are merely social. They're fantastic. He told us that in order to really be able to map a city, you gotta get completely drunk and then kind of like start kind of drifting around the city, getting totally lost, no? And using maybe a map of London when you're in Paris, in order to get even worse. Or just kind of understanding the city at the level of the roof, not drunk, of course, but at the level of the roof. And kind of like walking around on the roofs and kind of like reading the city about that. They gave us an enormous opportunity. And nowadays, after all these guys, and after the international situationists, I was in London and I listened personally, Bernard Schumi discussing about that. All the group that emanated from the AA on those times were strongly influenced by the situationists. And the theory of events by Bernard Schumi is somehow a scenario that comes after Guy Debord. It's very connected. His whole idea of diagramming, which I have the definitions for Schumi on that, right here. He says diagram is a graphic representation of a concept. Architecture is a materialization of concepts. Example, choreography of movement. And he made this amazing kind of like theory in the Manhattan transcripts in which kind of he tells us that the space is not about function, bubble diagrams are death. And nowadays we gotta understand the space as a series of events that are happening on that particular space. That could be completely different one to another one. And he creates the different programming, cross-programming, disprogramming, transprogramming, that I always tell that.
So Javier, I mean, I appreciate the list of all these different types of diagrams and how it's evolved over time from the beginning of time, I think you said. But how do you use diagram in your practice? And how do you pull diagrams, or how do you begin to employ diagrams at maybe the scale of the city or the scale of a house?
Well, I mean, my students know how I do it, and it's a process. It's a process, and for me, the most important part of developing architecture, creating architecture, is exactly that, the process of how you evolve from that. I do a series of different kind of diagrammings of absolutely everything. I mean, even kind of like If I'm gonna design a house, let's say, I analyze how my client kind of lives. I kind of map where he drops his underwear, like maybe right there, or the socks, like right there. I map kind of like how he assembles things on his house, how he interacts with the space, how he's moving, how his family is moving, how the dog is kind of wagging the tail on the space. There's many aspects that are happening on an architectural space. It's not just the traditional kind of like notion that we inherited from Le Corbusier that the space gotta be working for the human being as a piece of furniture. So the measurements of the body are, and the modular is basically kind of like reading the body as a simple kind of piece of furniture. I think the body is more than that, it's far more than that. So we can diagram absolutely everything, from economical kind of systems, from social systems, from physical systems, whatever, name it, everything is diagrammable.
Well, now that we talked about the general idea of the diagram, let's talk in particular in architecture and how we use it in the design process. Let's say, for instance, in studios, do you encourage students to begin with a diagram, or do you encourage them to begin somewhere elsewhere and then derive a diagram from their design? How do you teach it to your students for them to design?
Well, that's exactly what I was, I guess, explaining. But we can understand as well, there's some comments on here, and I don't remember where I pulled them out, in which kind of it's explained as well that a drawing, an architectural drawing, is a diagram. That we architects are the only ones that maybe can read it. Kind of like we're trying not to read CDs, but if we show that to our client, he will never understand that diagram. And that's the way we materialize architecture from there. So, as I was telling you, diagram is the process, the full process. It helps us for the full process. And he was right on his definition at the very beginning. It's about acquiring kind of information, okay, abstracting that information. But at the end, it's a tool. It's a tool that we use and apply in order kind of to develop something that is going to be architecture at the end.
So that would be cool if we could answer that question.
I completely agree that design is a tool. And I think if you want to create something chaotic, if chaos is your underlying paradigm, then go ahead, create chaos. I think design has to do with creating some kind of order, be it of a very, very complex kind. I do not believe that students can sit down and just draw a plan, sections, elevation. That's not how we work. I know that midterm review, and then we see plan, section, elevation, dot, study design, right? Any kind of design, any kind of music score, be it the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, is a diagram. And the performance of that, and we all are very familiar with performances of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, and there are many, many different ones. Any design is like a music score, and be that design finalized with labels and numbers and weights, or be it just spatial. And I think they're useful tools. But we have a whole list now, right? I mean, I'm still at my bubble diagram because I think it's very, very abstract. The solid void diagram used, as we see here, to represent the solid in public space versus the void, which is the public space, the private volumes. Bruno Zevi has worked on that. Is like, how do we really represent space? And I know that's another dinosaur. Bruno Zevi had looked at, do we really represent the solids as black versus white, or do we represent the space when architecture was defined as space? We can consider it, but then we have to, and he has these diagrams where he reinverts and represents the space as black and the streets as white, or the solids as white. So that duality between solid and void, which we work with, right? As architects, we kind of constantly between those two realms, right? You playing the role of the solids, I'm playing the role of spatial composition and space, and it really in the end doesn't matter. It's your coining, but it does help in what? In visualizing a lot of shapes and very complex compositions for which our dexterity here is epsilon zero. If you would take out and your cognitive map, the image in your head and what you have to draw, unless you're Mozart, there's no way you can sit down and just draw, like, I don't know, Frank Gehry, or even Frank Lloyd Wright. Even at 90 years old, he still made 100 diagrams before he even sat down and draw something. And I think he had a little bit of spatial dexterity, which most of us lack, I think that brain, we can't really design a building in the head. I think that takes a lot and years of experience to the cognitive map that we have in here. And I'm getting to the cognitive map and the situationalist, and I agree. Ask anybody to draw a map, not you, and before Google, draw a map of a city. And I remember, this was by a sociologist from the Netherlands, and he said, draw a map of Antwerp. We have small little cities all over. Draw a map. Draw a map. And I did this in my studio. Draw a map, draw a map. Right from the top of your head. Well, it's going to be that place is important and that place is important. There's, something, the big main street, Indiana and University. The cognitive map is, and it's an important one to visualize, which is not this one. This is the actual physical map, right? Out of, we try to get these worlds together. That's the whole thing. We try to communicate with design and materialize our ideas. Make them communicate through diagrams. I think diagrams is there to communicate more effectively than words or than your thoughts. Your concepts as images, I cannot read your mind. Although it only costs $600 an hour to have an MRI, and even that is not telling me that I might see the image in your brain.
An MRI is
I just found it out because I want to get some MRIs taken of brains. Serious. Hey, they do it for dogs. It's time that we know how we design here, how the brain really works when we design. So, and that's mapping the mind is really a beautiful.
There's a diagram I want you to put on the screen. That is Enrique Miralles, diagramming a croissant.
Croissant here?
Yes, it's lovely. It's lovely. Here we go.
Oh my goodness.
Where is it?
Just to follow up on something you said, I think the idea of flipping solid to void, like so the Noli map, one is mapping solid, one is mapping void. I mean, we know that one is solid and one is void, but by inverting that, it begins to trigger something. So by looking at that, we can actually, by diagramming, it's like, it could be an abstraction, but it begins to generate, maybe connect synapses in your brain to be like, oh, this is the spatial connection between mass and void, and this is how they begin to work, and that could create a generative process. So yes, you could look at a city of Rome and you could trace the map, or you can take the city of Rome and begin to think about solid and void, and then think about the relationships between those two.
I've thought about that a little bit. Why do we do the solid void? That big solid void. All these kind of, well, do you see the face of a woman or the face of a man and the solid void?
Well, that's Gestalt again.
That's
psychology.
Gestalt. Well, but why would architects, we didn't have that in Europe. We were in training, so in void. We did these analytic diagrams, even by hand, by the way, before everything else, as dinosaurs. But why are we doing this? And I thank you, Professor Rapp, points out a very important type of, this semester actually was just that in students. I had to make models and then photographs, and then diagram the photographs. And then, I hope she's not here, don't repeat me. It's like, I lost what I was looking at. And I said, that's exactly where I wanted to get you.
Yes.
That you forget. You see, we have a preconceived idea that, and I think that's what you're getting at, this is the IKEA. I'm not going to talk about the show because
I like the show.
Je parle français. It's not what you think of, and that is the object as is, right? We use it as a tool to explore and to maybe get epiphanies or see it different ways and play with our own brain. And lose it ourselves. Hey, I'm gonna get, and I like graph paper, translucent paper like that. Because, and then you work all night and then the paper gets on the floor and then you pick it up and then it's a reflection. Like, oh, wow, this is the solution to my problem. And that is, I think, spatial dexterity. And mapping helps us, exploring the domain, because what we do as designers is really very, very complex. When it comes about visual spatial material, it's extremely complex. And to me, they're just like our hands, but diagrams are tools.
Yeah, they're tools. They're tools for seeing differently. So,
yes.
I even think, so 1412 is one where actually we're looking at mass and they're flipping that, right? So they really begin to understand the relationship between mass and void, this solid void kind of relationships, and we do that. Let me just continue that thought. So that's something we're doing in 1412, and then in teaching construction class, obviously we can't go out and build buildings, right? So the idea of looking at precedents and actually at the abstraction of those wall sections, I require them to diagrammatically build wall sections, which begins, it's an abstraction of the actual wall, but actually by asking them to use the same material for all of them, or the same similar types of material, they have to really begin to think about how those pieces go together. And one of the questions that my students had are like, well, it's wood, why can't I build it out of wood? Or, it's steel, why can't I build it out of steel? And I'm like, well, you're not building the building, it's an abstraction, it's a diagram. And then, so I think even construction documents or other diagrams construction documents, or the packet that we actually give to the set of instructions we give to the contractor, that's essentially a diagram, like the Duchamp. It's like, this is how this is put together. These are all the components. This is how things go together. So there's a level of understanding of how those things go together. You're actually not building the full thing, but you're using diagram, you're using abstraction, you're using, and at that point, once it gets to the CDs, it's less of, maybe it's a generative tool of how to actually build the building, but it's not a generative tool of the process. So I think, again, you can diagram anything, but then how do you begin to use diagrams in the early stages to begin to initiate a dialogue, whether it's internal dialogue or a dialogue between other people, of how to design or how to arrive at these situations or spatial objects. But then, at the end, it's about how do I convey those ideas, through specifications or wall sections or models or a BIM model or whatever. So again, I think diagram's a very loose term, and I think we can, I could say
Sorry, I just.
Oh yes.
I would like the panel to be a bit more restrained with how you are defining diagram. Because I don't see construction documents as a diagram, and I actually don't see the knowing map as a diagram. I think that map and diagram get really close, but even in this casual conversation of the map as a diagram, it's actually not a diagram. It's a map because it deals with the terra, it deals with the land, it deals with kind of a very tangible relationship, and that is a more interrelated, connected relationship of drawing a pathway that is actually dealing with earth and soil and the type of mapping as opposed to the diagram, which is, and I agree with, there were times in which you talked about the synthesis of the information and having the diagram be about a very specific edited content. And I think that's really correct as well, that's very true. But I really disagree with the idea that the diagram is everything.
Well, let me tell you something, and I think some of your quotes come from James Corner, The Agency of Mapping. Mapping could be a tracing of a city, like example, a tracing of the topography, a tracing of something. Kind of the Nolli plan is a direct kind of tracing of the city of Rome. Somehow, there's this process as well of tracing, but he explains that traces propagate redundancies. Mappings discover new world. In the moment that we're discovering that new world, I think that the mapping transforms itself into a diagram. In the moment that we just do it in a strict kind of tracing of whatever we're kind of like, it is a map. I mean, when we Google Earth something, I mean, we pull out a map, a real map of what is that viewing from a satellite or whatever. In the moment that we start kind of like working with that map, as in the case scenarios, what Colin Rowe did, by creating the Gestalt kind of controversy on that map, then the map, in my point of view, becomes a diagram itself. It's giving us a different information than what the map itself.
If the drawing has a very specific relationship to orientation and pathway, it's a map. It's not a diagram. Like if it has to do with a relationship back to the earth or back to the ground. So even if you, like the situationists, and they're derived through Paris, that's a map. That's the situation is.
It's an interpretation of a map. It is very clear what James Corner said, no? That in the moment that we're uncovering realities, then we are kind of like developing a diagram of that map. And he explains on here very, very well, I mean, all the process that he tells on his writings, know about the different kind of mapping conditions and so on. The drifting, the strata, the game board, the reason. And we can go back on that to Deleuze and Guattari on Thousand Plateaus. And they explain very clearly that diagram is a set of relationships between forces. When we're reading a map, a Nolly map or a figureground drawing, I would like to say it more figureground drawing. What I'm kind of like discovering on that is exactly what Deleuze is telling us over here. Two different forces. Whatever is kind of like rendered in white, whatever is rendered in black. So then we kind of like put them together and we're analyzing kind of like the contrast between the built versus the unbuilt. And in that moment, it's not a map anymore. And I guess that moment is when we can understand it as a diagram.
Are you saying then that mapping compared to a diagram, like mapping has place and it becomes a diagram when it no longer holds that place?
Mapping for me is a direct tracing of the realities of certain territory or realities of kind of like built environment or whatever.
So it's a tracing, but a tracing is different than a diagram. And a diagram is different than when we're talking, sometimes I think in studio we get confused between what a generative diagram is between a way or a process in which we create a system. Because you can create a process that has a series of drawings that helps you develop an architectural language, but that is different from a diagram. So what, in your opinion, are exactly those differences in order to dispel that confusion for the students in studio?
Well, it's
that I think is an interesting thing. I'm going to throw that down. A map, you can map a virus. You can map trash. You can map the trajectory of things. So I think that there's a lot of semantic discussion going on here, and where to utilize those different tools is always a struggle. So a map to a survey, to a diagram, to a vignette, to a partie, there's a lot of different things. So I wonder if the conversation is about how to utilize all of these things as an idea of generative process or kind of a living reciprocity that you have with these types of drawings, or if it is, are we trying to define map, survey, diagram, right? Like, are we asking how do we use them? How do we use these types of tools? Because I think that they're a really broad range, and all of them really suggest relation and position. So the Nolly map, in my opinion, takes a position. So map, diagram, whatever you want to say, it's saying I'm interested in public and private, and I'm going to learn from that position. Whereas all these other maps are taking different positions and how different things are relating together in other ways. So I think I just wanted to inject that as a map or a diagram, which I go through a lot. I still struggle with how I personally define each of those. So
I completely agree with everything that's said, actually, because you're very right. And let me, hang on with me. You know, this is the English language. And I make this big statement. Designers design designs. So the word design is chasing too many meanings. The word mapping, maps, because one has a metaphor, is a conceptual mapping between different types of domains. So it can be conceptual mapping, but here I use the action, what we call process. So I think when we stuck with the noun, you know, what is a diagram, what is versus the action mapping, diagramming as process, versus who is mapping, and usually it's a human brain. Well, we can discuss that later. But I think what Professor McReynolds is kind of hinting at, and I'm trying to clarify here, I don't have an answer, that there is quite a difference between like all the way when we go back to the turn of the previous century, where we went into abstract art, that painting was no longer a representation of an outside reality, which the Noli map is, which Google Maps are. They are merely representations, mappings, transformations. Here, there are different types of transformations, all the way from identity to scaled versions, to affine projections, to perspective projections, to topological projections. But I'm looking at how, in a very transitionary phase from symbolic painting, where we started abstracting, these people started abstracting. They were not any longer, painting cows as cows are the nudes. Because, the nudes was a very, the nudes, was an object to be, in the Beaux-Arts tradition, indeed diagrammed, drawn. But think about the nude descending the stairs, the nude descending the stairs.
Marcel Duchamp.
Yeah, again, your hero. That was, how can we now abstract, and even Cubism, and from different points of view try to diagram that? And is maybe, if we use diagram, it's more about this abstraction rather than the representation of the reality, which is maybe more tracing. I don't know, I'm trying to help and, clarify, where we, I think, in bubble diagrams, or even in that we are moving way away from actually literally representing, and you start seeing how they, try to see, the new descending the stairs in there. Is that the type of diagramming we're talking about? Is that what we're doing in architecture with diagrams? That we are mediating between reality and imagination, and imaginary landscapes and dreamscapes maybe, rather than actualities or things that are performable at this point. So otherwise we don't have visionary architecture, which is always nice to have, I think. And I think exploring the potential with even computer renderings and three-dimensional shapes, and with blobs like Greg Lynn, and with Dupuis of the Lowe's, and they went so far in visualizing, which to me is also a diagram. It's a mapping, and I think that's part of what we do. We try to break out of to just use shapes to represent what already exists. But, that's a higher way to me, to abstract. And I think diagramming follows that in a little bit. And then there is the famous solid versus void, right? Space versus the construction, because that's what we do as architects, right? We design the spaces, but we also design the solids, right? That's what you do in construction. You think about the solids, and then we look at the surface, because actually that's what we experience, right? We really are not living in the solid. Neither do we really design the space. How do we experience space? Is through the surface. So then we start using light, right, to reflect the light and walls, and so all these faces that we work through and think about, we try to represent them with diagrams. I'm sorry. Until we find the prescription of the IKEA box or the Duchamp maze to be made. Yes.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just a quick, question to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to redirect because you asked a really great question early on about how do we use these diagrams, and I think right now we're quickly getting into this cyclical conversation of semantics rather than the agency of I have a question and I'm asking through this thing called a diagram, and then that leads to a process or a project. And so I just want to redirect the question back to your very clear question, which is how do we use the diagram?
Right, and I think, so for me, mapping is more akin to tracing, and I find the diagram is not tracing or not representing, but it's describing something. So for me, the diagram could start with the tracing, maybe it's an overlay, and then you can begin to develop and kind of find the lines or find the solid and void or walls and overhangs. But for me, I think the diagram becomes, I mean, I've seen before, like a diagram is a kind of a graphic shorthand, but I think it's beyond that, because what I try to ask, especially my 14, 12 students is like, when you draw a line, there's an intelligence, I think, at a certain point where, if you draw a thin line, maybe it's glass, maybe it's something on the ground, maybe it's a kind of a territory where you're thinking about inside or outside or a zone, larger zone, but it doesn't have to actually be there. But with the diagram, you can begin to begin to describe different areas or different zones or different kind of territories or ideas of enclosure or solidness versus openness. So then there's a dashed line might represent something above, and you begin to use a diagram. I think diagrams are equally, I mean, the one problem with the bubble diagram is that it's just in plan, but I think diagram really becomes sectional too. So a sectional diagram, so beginning to think about the space of how a person moves through, or how light enters the enclosure, or even a diagrammatic model will maybe not be clear exactly what you want it to be, but by doing several diagrammatic models, maybe you have an idea of kind of spatial, how spaces should be aligned or connected or separated, and then through the analysis of that, the analysis actually happens during the drawing or during the model, as well as after you've created this, whether it be looking at the figure ground or the ground figure. You can begin to analyze that and then make decisions and make the next diagram. So for me, the diagram is an integral part of the design process, and for me, it's more of the kind of the finding the line or finding where the wall could be. So for me, that's kind of maybe the main thing, is where tracing is like, I know where the building is and I'm drawing it. And that could be mapping. But I think an overlay onto the map could be a diagram where you are actively designing or actively thinking about creation of space, architecture, or even landscape. I think the diagram is a tool, and I think especially the more you diagram or the more you draw. And I find, for me, diagramming with a pencil or pen or a marker is much faster and more imprecise. So that the idea that I'm not drawing like the final drawing. It's really about kind of finding. So that's the kind of the fluid nature of diagrams. Maybe that's why we're all kind of saying, it could be this or it could be that. It could be anything, because it can. I think still a diagram could be anything. But how a diagram can be used, I actually kind of dislike the kind of the end post-rationalization. Oh, this is what I've done, and this is me drawing it again. I think that's not as useful. It's not really useful. It's useful maybe for the presentation or a portfolio where you're not there. But as a generative tool, I think there's nothing quite like a diagram. And a diagrammatic model where you're actually assembling things or thinking about how the layers go together, or a drawing, whether it be a section or plan. I think all of those. Maybe that didn't answer Jenna's question.
Even though you insulted Marcel Duchamp, and I will not forgive you for that, I totally agree with what you just said. I think that's exactly one of the main points. I want to put out, just a minute, I want to pull out a couple of images here, please. And that will come related to the Diagram Diaries by Peter Eisenman. So please pull out one project by Peter Eisenman that is named Arrows, Errors, and Other Errors. Arrows, Errors, and Other Errors.
Errors?
Arrows, errors, like big mistakes. No, errors as the god of love, whatever.
Love.
And
more
errors,
love.
like
More
mistakes.
love from you.
Arrows, errors, and other errors. Okay, and of course, kind of like if you can find a diagram of the city of culture in Santiago, that would be very interesting. Eisenman gets more complicated with his idea of diagrams, but I think it's quite interesting and follows up what Peter was just telling us a few minutes ago. He says that diagrams, he believes in diagrams as an intermediate or interstitial condition which lies between space and time, between the architecture object and the interiority of architecture. Sorry, that's my mother. Okay, the diagram acts as an agency which focuses the relationship between an authorial subject, architectural object, and a receiving subject. It becomes quite complicated. Of course, he gets into post-structuralism and start talking us about kind of signifier in his spaces, and so that's a good one. That one that you just pulled out in the the color one from below. Go down, and left side, that's it. Okay, Peter Eisenman does the process of mapping first, understanding and reading kind of the map. But then he kind of like separates the map from its particular kind of condition, from its site actually, and bring it into a different environment. In the case of Santiago, that's exactly what he did. He overlapped or superimposed a map of the old town of Santiago into the grid system, the double grid system that he created in order to design this cultural center. This is in the outskirts of the city and mimics as well the hills. So it's kind of three different conditions. Trying to condition it to the hills where he's positioned it. Second, kind of bringing the memory of the town that is maybe 5 miles away from here and put it on top of this one, and then kind of creating a double grid system as well for developing his design. It becomes very intricate and kind of very elaborated in a certain way. But by grasping kind of this information from the map, he's creating a diagram, and that's the difference, I guess, between mapping and diagramming. In the other project, in the Arrows, Eros, and Other Eras, which I guess it is right there, the first image, on this one, this is a very beautiful project. I love this one, on the city of Verona, in which he read Shakespeare and kind of like tried to bring the idea of Romeo and Juliet into the city, and kind of like start mapping by reading the novel, which were kind of the pathways that Romeo was taking in order to visit kind of Juliet. It's a novel. I mean, for sure, Romeo and Juliet never existed. We know that the families, yes, existed, the Montesquieu and the Capuletos. But the whole story of Romeo and Juliet is just a novel. But he recreated the novel into this beautiful kind of diagram, which differs to what could be considered as a map. Underneath, we have a layer, which is a map of the city of Verona. But every single new tracing that happened on here is his interpretation of the book. I think that's a beautiful kind of story. So I don't know if that clarifies a little bit more, but I totally agree with what Peter just said a few minutes ago.
So talking about what Rob said, Professor Rob said, it seems like the 3D diagram is like it's becoming this generative process. And so does that 3D diagram eventually become the project? And I mean, talking about maybe making it perform rather than just become something representational.
That's where I was trying to get confused in the conversation. You talk about diagrams as a process, you also talk about diagrams as a tool, and there's a big difference.
Right, that's a very good question, and that's something that I see a lot in not just the school, but a lot of schools where you have some sort of, you've created a diagram, so you've actually created a model, or even worse, you've created a plan, a diagram plan, then you just extrude everything, and then you kind of maybe manipulate the forms a little bit, and that's the architecture. And that's really dangerous. That's, I think, where the diagram becomes a mapping, almost, where you actually begin to use, you've lost what it's describing. So you've lost the spatial significance, or you've lost, or maybe haven't thought about it, it's only an idea of maybe mapping, or maybe I'm not answering this very well. This is a very difficult question, which I've actually asked myself a lot. But it's not just an extrusion, and it's not just this is where the line is on the plan, and this is where that wall should be. But I think it needs to, the iterative process needs to continue past the diagram, or past the 3D model or 3D diagram, because it's really about the spatial significance of architecture. And I find that when a student, or when someone actually just extrudes or just takes that form, at a certain point they just like, I'm done with the process and this is it, and I'm going to extrude it, and I'll just put some windows or a door, or make things put the program in, stuff the sausage, right? That's really dangerous, and I think that's a problem, and that actually results in something that's like, oh, well, look from afar, it looks great. But I think you actually need to, it comes down to maybe how you're describing the process, or how you're describing the space, and then it becomes, okay, how does the person interact with the space? And is the qualities of space that I'm trying to derive, or that I'm trying to establish in my diagrams, is that within the section? Is that within each of these spaces? And how am I using the architecture to further the diagram, or further my ideas? So no, it's not just I've got a form and then I'm done. But I think the diagram needs to happen at not just the global scale of the city, the global scale of the architecture, but also at the kind of intimate scale of the human. And I find, instead of designing from the outside in, which a lot of people do, if you actually, at a certain point, if you actually switch to the inside, and then you begin to manipulate the form or the building based off of the human experience and kind of the spatial significance that you aspire to create with the architecture, then I think it continues the iterative process. You can actually continue to design past that kind of formal idea of what architecture is.
So do you think, along with this generative diagram, when you begin you have an idea and then you begin to diagram, do you think there's a point where you have to set aside the diagram and just execute, or do you keep using the diagram even when you're executing the project?
Well, there's something important here. You said that when you have an idea, it's not about kind of like waiting for the Holy Spirit to come and kind of enlighten us and give us the idea just like that, because that never happens. Okay, I don't believe on that. Even kind of like copy me blog, they talk of the moment, the instantaneous moment of inspiration. But I pretty much believe that we follow up kind of whatever information we already have in our brain. So the process of mapping is about acquiring the information. The process of diagramming is about manipulating that information. And then from there we can evolve into a project. But this whole idea of starting from scratch, from zero, like idea, I think is very dangerous. I don't know where it will drive us.
It's also not a linear process. Like, it's not like I got the diagram, then I do the model, and I'm doing the details, and
But that's design, that's not diagramming.
Right, but
Let me pick up on what you said.
Okay.
I'm listening carefully here. What to you is a line when you draw it? Or assuming that your diagram is built up of lines, literally. Let's focus in, because we see a lot of examples with line drawings. So, and you talked about a line. What to you is the line? Is the line the boundary of your wall? Is the line the boundary of your territory? Is the line the boundary? It was Popova with her architectonic who said like the line is the trace of a wall, which I thought was really nice. But I think that when you diagram the line, and there was a quote sent to me about that a diagram is not an entity in itself, and I would completely disagree with that. That actually the line and that pictorial element, that's something infinite, right? That might be anything. We can erase part of it. It's not just those two lines. A line is an infinite, continuous thing that we can erase. And here the overlapping of diagrams in two dimensions, right? Because it's kind of phenomenological transparency. And I think that's why we diagram. We diagram because the line can be many things at different times. And the line might be a boundary, it might represent a solid, it might represent a void, and we start searching, in that continuity what it can be. So I'm really into when you diagram, it cannot be something that represents something because we don't know what that something is. So it is something that can be many things at any time. That's not diagrams, these are, I really, that's what you're doing, and that's what phenomenological transparency, that's what they were heading at, is this world that is spatially relatively abstract, where point lines or areas and what they do, and these emergent properties that overlap into grids. You get all these emerging shapes that cognitively, it's a square grid, and then there are some, things overlaid on that, and that's what deconstructivism is, but it's the overlay that all of a sudden you start all these emergent properties, and there's a problem with spatial material to formalize it. Computer scientists break their head on this, but we love it. That's where we become creative, I think. So we at the heart of it, what it is we're doing with diagramming, as understanding the line as a boundary, as an entity that is continuous, that can be erased in many different ways, something that designers do that computers should, but they don't. That's why we go back to flatland, then extrude it, and then we make three-dimensional models. And I think, and I love that idea of Professor Rabb of, diagram is not only a two-dimensional kind of pictorial representation, it could also be a model, a three-dimensional kind of model. But again, I think that the medium here, to paraphrase McLuhan, the media is the massage, but the medium is the message. That was the intended title. It became published as Massage. So in that pragmatic kind of view is that if you draw two-dimensionally, in the two-dimensional, which is spatially extremely abstract, versus three-dimensional or the materiality that the diagram has. Because when you make a physical model, you select what is physical, present, and then you remap it. I think between the 2D and 3D, that dialogue is the one that holds, generatively, as explorative tool, where you do not necessarily prefigure what a line will be or prefigure what the area is.
I think we're going a bit further, kind of like in the process of designing rather than just the diagram per se. Can you kind of like pull out Daniel Levesky in the Jewish Museum, please? That's another good example for you guys to try to understand this idea of diagramming.
Just to further this point real quick, because I just wanted to call something she said that I think was really important with the idea of emergence. I really like hearing the panel discuss all these very different matters, and I think something to take away from this, especially this idea of emergence, is to me a diagram is a living and breathing thing. It changes every day, right? So I learned from the diagram just as much as the diagram is teaching me. This idea of emergence, when you draw a line, something has emerged to you. You've seen something that you respond to, that you change and you modify, and then it changes and you see something new. So the position that you start to take with the diagram is both revealing and something that you're interacting with. So it's not autonomous, but at the same time, it's not something that you yourself are doing. That's why I think a diagram is not used, it's not an either or, generative or representational or demonstrative. That's what makes it so hard to talk about. And that's what's so great about hearing all these different views, is the diagram can do it all. And it's just a tool, and how do you start to utilize that? How do you see from your diagram and understand your projects in certain ways, just as much as it generates your project. So one should never stop and say, oh, the diagram's done, here's my building. Because you have an assessment of building on top of it, it's changed the diagram. And then your building changes because the diagram shifted. So for me, the diagram is always a cyclical thing. It's going back and forth through your project, both as a generator, and then even at the end, like Big, using it as an end product to describe it to someone else. So it's a level of reduction, and even in practice, I'll go back to the diagram halfway through CDs because I've forgotten what I'm all about. Where's the essence of my project? What am I doing? Oh, the diagram. That'll help me cycle back into my own project from my head. So the diagram, I think, should be thought of not as an only beginning until you finally get to make a building. Right. It should be utilized as a tool that allows you to assess relational value and the position at which you are taking of those conditions. So I think the idea of emergence is a really great point.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and also the idea that the design process, the process is a cyclical thing. So, like, if you have a word or an idea of what you want to do, and then you diagram it, and then you build a model, and then you test. You have to test those things. So, and I always, when I get in like difficulty with like a drawing, and I can't go further, I will write something, and then if I have trouble there, I'll go to building a model, and so really trying to find kind of getting closer and closer and closer, hopefully, to that what I'm striving for, that I'm trying to design. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So, from my kind of point of view as a student, in my feeble understanding of what a diagram is, and the way that I employ it in my process, for me, it's been a materialization of my thought process. And it's not a question of either or, but it's both and, going back to the original question that you guys put forward, which is it the initial process of design, or is it a byproduct of design? For me, it's been both. And I think going back to what you just said, what she just said, it's a dynamic process that's living. And for me, the culmination of the inspiration that I find, and I think Mr. Gomez you'll love, because he's so relevant in today's study of architectural representation, is Perry Culver. Michigan. And I think it's beautiful drawings that I think are starting to represent both, and it's not either or, it's action drawing.
Yeah, I saw that you showed them.
Described it.
And there's a new series now. It's going to be publishing pretty soon as well. It's photography. It's lovely work, and it's very diagrammatic. Everything that is represented on there. He's following more or less the same tessiture of the University of London, Bartlett, and this whole idea kind of like mapping, similar as Neil Spiller, which is another guy that kind of follows the same idea as Perry Cooper, and Raoul von Schotten, which has also a very beautiful project named The Skin of the Earth, which is also diagramming the Earth in very beautiful ways. But the work of Perry Cooper is fantastic. I really love it. And nowadays he's working pretty hard on that.
And it's very emergent. Like if you've actually seen the drawings, there are actually 100 layers of mylar, and then he'll like pull some up closer, push some further away to begin to collect this kind of multivalent mapping. I call this a mapping maybe more than that.
This was the kind of school I attended when I was in the AA. This was exactly what we were working on in the AA. These kind of mappings and these kind of processes and so on. I particularly find myself very attached to this kind of information because I was there when that was happening. That was a long time ago as well.
So does anybody else have a question for the panelists?
Yes?
So when you say the diagram is basically essentially this living organism, well, it's a living thing, I suppose, but really just an interpretation of each and every reality that we...
You can diagram absolutely everything, whatever, your shoes, whatever, doesn't matter, your neighbor. But in the moment that you're diagramming, you're kind of like creating kind of like something, it's generating something, as exactly what Maria just told us a few minutes ago, what Maria told us. And then that moment when it's generating something, there's a lot of potential for start designing on something. I want to show you another example.
Wait a minute, I want to add to that.
Okay.
These type, we draw shapes, we combine them, you overlap them, you see the shapes emerging out of it. But it takes a human cognitive, what you will diagram out of that, or so which is the interpretation, which is the decomposition, which is putting two things together makes a whole when you can be taken apart in multiple different ways. And so that is the layers and layers and layers, and that process is it's non-deterministic, and out of here you can diagram what you call tracing, but there I agree we could use the diagramming. That is the process where we recognize, what you see is what you get, and then you diagram that out, and that process is one that again, it is because now the two shapes overlap, and all of a sudden you see the triangle emerging, and then you diagram that triangle. And here we're talking about a very primitive knowledge that we have of what geometry is, which is a triangle, a circle, and a square, and that's all. When I ask students what is geometry, the triangle, square, and then they remember maybe the trapezoid. This is not what shapes are all about. everything like this is shapes. We can't describe them in words, but we can trace them. And, this interpretation, you can, see that you take the boundary, for example, but I might just take one piece of that line and one piece of that line, like the bold lines on the right side, that's exactly what he's doing. He has patches of colors, he has patches of bold line, so that is his interpretation. And there are multiple interpretations of that this is a generative kind of layer. Now you can start with something very complex, and there's nice diagrams with figures and images on it, or it can be very, very simple because two squares, put them together, and what do you get? Draw them, and you will see you get many, many answers. Is that correct? And take them apart, and you get even more examples. And that's what the design world is all about. That is what the spatial world is all about. It's a very complex world. And there are new algebras developing, and Professor Park knows about that also, in order to capture the possibilities, I think, of what it is we're doing. So a line, might be something, but it's also this, the bold line versus the area there that he's kind of extracting. And I think it's beautiful. And it's a very fun type of thing to do, that we finally get, all the tools to do this freely, right? I mean...
It begins with the tracing, but it evolves and generates something else. It's not just the mere tracing.
A tracing is not gratuit. Tracing takes an interpretation.
Yes.
But it's your reading. Shakespeare is there, but you can read it in multiple ways.
Yeah,
your tracing is not gratuit. It is an act of resistance. It's an act. It's a cognitive decision that you make as designer. Now, try to model that in a computer. I beg your pardon.
Diagramming for me, like going back to like what is a line? Like diagramming is a statement. So I could push this hard. I could use a different pen. I could use a Sharpie. I could use paintbrush. Like there are different ways to draw a line, or I could dash it. And like with the author, the person who is diagramming, they make a statement. They begin to decide how to describe their ideas or how to describe a space using a variety of tools. And I think the diagram is nice because you actually use a limited palette. You use a limited, easily determined by you and maybe by someone else who's reading the diagram what things begin to mean. So a line at one point could be a piece of glass. It could be nothing. It could actually or be erased. Or by drawing several lines, maybe I begin to something emerges and I'm like, oh, this needs to be thicker or more solid or more open. So, but the diagram is a way of explaining those thoughts and thinking as you're drawing. So that's for me.
And he would change his pen.
Yes,
and make a build one. I mean, that's also a medium we have forgotten, right? Unfortunately, this one doesn't have an eraser. The two basic operations, we draw lines, and we can erase them also.
You just get more paper.
No, I mean, the boundary there, the black line, when you look at these diagrams, the black line, the bold line, part of it are retraced and part of them are, not retraced. So it's an interpretation to do that, right? I mean, you can take the same portion and start diagramming that. But again, the medium is the message here,
I think it's really important to underscore two things here with both of you are saying. One is that there's an agenda or a message to be interpreted, and if it's not accurate, it's problematic. And as much as I'm very fond of Perry and love his work, I also think it's super dangerous right now to put this up and say this is a diagram. These are so freaking beautiful that it's hard to look away from them. And for me, the big test about whether something's a good diagram or not is, what are you going to build with that? What are you going to build with that that's going to take that somewhere else? Or is it just put it in a frame, love it, and stop there?
Well, that's possible.
Say that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value for the discipline and value for us, but for me, the essential piece of the conversation about diagram is that it stays an intermediary tool that helps the project along. And it ultimately comes down to the question for me is, are we architects that make spaces that we inhabit? Or are we architects that make architectural-ish images that we fall in love with. And that's a very different path.
Chris, I believe that Leibniz was one of the top architects of the 20th century, almost 21st century as well, even though he just built one piece which we cannot even consider as a building. I believe that many architects kind of have developed their agenda by doing these things. I believe on architecture is never built, and never going to be built.
Who?
Lebbeus Woods.
Leibniz Woods.
He had a whole career of build work prior to entering teaching.
But that didn't matter because the main one was what he created afterwards.
Well, I think
The one
that's
that
not what Professor...
moved him forward.
No, I agree. I fully agree. I don't think that's what he meant. You're talking about something completely different. Again, I think it's just a step. I mean, it's a phase of exploration, and I think that's the whole task in studio. And that's why I believe we do way more research in studio than, the engineers in their labs. I mean, because this is very hard. Take this, and when does it stop to be art, and when does it become significant boundary of a wall, of the layer of the space, the circulation, the vessel, because really, of energy, light, sound, and I think that these are all, things we evoke, categories we evoke to start guiding our interpretation. Because, as artists, we can do anything we want. As architects, not. We evoke, is that a wall section? I'm sorry, because they're all over. Is that a wall section? Could that be a boundary of my solid? Could that be, a translucent skin? Could that be, the insulation layer? Could that be space bounding? So that's what we do. And I think that's very, very complex. And I think formally it's very complex because, that's what they try to formalize. But it never worked because, spatial material like that is very important. And I think what we do, that's why you still diagram. And I said, if an old architect still has to diagram, if Frank Gehry still has to build 100s of models and do these sketches, very humbly, by the way, right? Even though he has a big name, it means something. It means that, we need it as an extension of our brain. That's all I'm saying. It's a tool. For us, it's a tool, right? And the tools will change the way we conceive and potentially, perform architecture. Performing meaning, writing the design so it might be performed now, or maybe it's unbuilt, but it's still performed. Graham Colas didn't build for a long time, and then, now he builds quite a bit. But I remember, because I'm a dinosaur, I remember what my first students, not having built a thing. And there was a lot of debate, especially in Europe, you have to understand. But you see where, the exploration, his growth period was bigger, and he tried to push the envelope bigger.
A good example of that is the Hedgehog, which, he spent his life doing diagrams. And his built work was done after he passed away, just in terms of kind of memory. So I believe that this kind of work, like Perry Cooper, going back to that thing, could be very important the way it is. Exactly the same as what happened with Leibniz Woods, I was telling you, and many others, Etienne Roulet and many other people.
Why was this image selected?
That's the very last one.
No, that's the first. Because this is, you all recognize this, right?
It's Parte la Ville.
I don't know, that might be contentious, but Schumi being such a Cartesian, right, Cartesian thinker, right, I suspect that his diagram of the Parc de la Villette was made after he actually designed it. And it is an imposed cognitive square grid, because that's what it is, with slide. He really literally imposed it. And so where, the two grids that be superimposed, intersect with existing buildings, that's all of a sudden where the contingency arises, that's where the problem of design arises. But his diagram was not, and I will have to research it, but I suspect that he did not use the diagram as a mode of generating design, but rather a mode of explaining later on in his design
There's something interesting on this process.
And this is very, very early.
During the process of the competition is when he met Jacques Derrida. And somehow kind of like the intervention of Jacques Derrida came late on the process of designing Parc de la Ville. So maybe that's what made all this what you're talking about.
Yeah, but Tschumi had way more inspiration, even though he doesn't say it, from Kandinsky and his pictorial elements, point, line, and plane, and Descartian grids that he superimposed. He's in the color is not red. This is something we can kind of look at. But I think he's more like the cognitive thinker. It's easy to superimpose a quadrilateral grid on the American West, right? That's that cognitive map. That is how, Lubbock was planned. We have the map of Lubbock, it wasn't even 96, it's earlier, right? The square superimposed. So why we do the inverse thing, the merging of the existing versus, maybe the extension. I think it means a lot in urban design. It also is an expression of, you're probably, you're the expert on that one, on landscape. It's kind of, it's a respect of starting not with a blank canvas or superimposing the colonial Anglo-Saxon footprint in the American West, but actually merging the existing and overlaying that with the new and letting it very merge. And I think that's where you have the manipulated ground movement that is coming up. And I think it's done with great sensitivity for Gaia after the 60s. And I think, it expresses more than just the diagram is a way, the fact that we can use them, also that we have them. Because one might wonder why the word got so widespread after the Gutenberg press and the image not. But you have to understand, images are very expensive to reproduce. Even artwork is very difficult to reproduce. It's very expensive. Now, even art store has done that a little bit better. That you can zoom in and see the details. But these type of emergent elements were predicted now that we can. But as a librarians, the hardest part is digitizing images. Or this is a whole area that they still have to explore. And more archives are actually digitizing their plan sections, diagrams of architects, but it's still in its infancy. Once that starts moving around in the world, and now the kids can Google everything, there will be a dramatic change in the world, and that's because of the way of communicating. And words were easier printed, and books were easier communicated than the diagrams. They're very expensive to reprint and to communicate. But the dinosaurs know about this. The little, what is a beautiful young animal? Oh my God, the eagle. You all young people, you take that for granted, but that you have all that information available. You can get any map, all the maps, all these slides, all these drawings. So, Google them and you have them.
Yeah. Sorry, but well, along with your conversation, do you guys have closing statements about the diagram?
Well, I think diagrams are definitely very, very important on the process of making architecture, and we should understand it as a living entity. The diagram is morphing, the diagram is generating. In the moment that maybe kind of like it's not generating something, we need to kind of like read it again and see if something is wrong over there. But it's a tool, it's a generative tool that help us really strongly in developing architecture.
I think the facility, the easiness of the more we can do with a computer, the more we can do by hand, the more we can use the diagramming as to use Susan Langer's forms, the presentational forms rather than discursive forms. And I think that it had to wait. It's so complex. And you might not be aware of that because we're doing poetic, kind of pragmatic interpretations. But I think it had to wait till the 21st century, and I think by a dozen, 20 years from now, the visual spatial literacy, we all talk about literacy and it's always about writing and things like that, but our ability to comprehend and understand and communicate about visual spatial literacy, which this one is an element from, this will evolve, I think, dramatically, and we're all part of it together in seeing it developing. And that is really great for architects because what we do is really very special, and we're leading the way in problem solving, if I might use that old term, in using visual, spatial symbols in order to solve many problems, both in 2 and 3 dimension, or in 2 to the ordered fractal dimension. I think these are certain great emerging fields, and we will need new tools. But then again, I started with computers. This is actually what brought me to the United States. But I think the designer's brain, the cognitive, what we do in our brain, and to formalize that, which is, part of not a professional architect, but that's what is always intriguing me. And I think we're going, very, very. We will see a lot of differences, especially in your career. Think about these words in 10, 20 years from now. It's almost unpredictable what could happen. Also with spatial dimensions, all the way up. So pan-dimensionality, or what Lisinski called pangeometry. It was really about multidimensionality, pangeometry of multiple dimensions, the spatial dimension in one's work versus the primitive point line planes, volumes, the pictorial elements that one uses. And I think that is, it's finally, I think, starting to become common, and a great source of inspiration and exploration, actually. I wish you the best of luck. It's up to you now because the dinosaurs are extinct almost.
So you're going to come on a dinosaurs?
Well, he wanted to be controversial, so I make it controversial. So we will be distinct. It's up to the new generation, and that's good. That's great. There are other things in life to do that. So.
I mean, for me, I think it's interesting to hear all of us talk about diagram, which is the same word, but we all interpret the diagram differently, and we probably use the diagram differently. And I think that the more important thing for me is that to understand that the diagram is spatial and it's also informative. So it's describing and kind of embodying the process of, it can embody the process of architecture, or post-rationalize the process, if you're representing something at the end of the process of architecture. So you may use a 3-dimensional tool, you may use a sketch, you may use something else, but using diagram to distill your ideas and to distill your kind of framework or your architecture, using a few lines or a few colors, I think is a really important tool, not only in representing, but also to further your thoughts about architecture. So however you use diagram, I think it's really important to use it as, and to be kind of use it liberally in your design process. And it's not about the final thing, even though a line could emerge or be pushed down. But I think the diagram is a really important way to further the architectural process, and something we use, I think, a lot in the school. So I think it was nice to have a discussion about what is the diagram and how can it be used.
Yeah,
so thank you.
Thank you very much for participating in the discussion, and as well as the students.
Any questions?